Under the cold lights of Fairmont Crest, a buried truth finally surfaces: Doug did not die on that fateful night. Randy pulled him back from the edge, giving him breath while costing him his legs and any sense of freedom. Once the man who owned every room with his stride, Doug returns in a wheelchair to face the invisible staircases of pitying stares, the half-closed doors of power, and the eager hands ready to turn his tragedy into a profitable spectacle. This video rewinds the clock to expose the choices, secrets, and calculations that shoved Doug into this brutal present, then follows his shadowed comeback, where every centimeter forward is bought with pride, loneliness, and bitter compromise. If you're ready for a truth without triumphant music, let's begin. Jason had always moved through Fairmont Crest with a velocity that irritated enemies and delighted friends, a man who measured worth by the length of his stride and the certainty of his decisions. Before the crash, his days were made of quick handshakes and longer shadows, a routine of meetings, dinners, and late-night drives that stitched together a version of success everyone else called admirable and he called necessary. The rituals protected him from the small tremors he refused to acknowledge, a business partnership that ran on secrets, a marriage that grew fragile under the pressure of appearances, a son whose questions were getting sharper. The night the guardrail disappeared beneath the headlights and the world tilted into ravine and silence, it was not instant oblivion that claimed him. It was pain that arrived like a storm without a center, then a colder truth that someone else's hands were pulling him back toward breath. Randy, who should never have been on that road, who had his own reasons for avoiding police reports and hospital forms, made a decision that would define all of them: keep Jason alive, keep Jason hidden, and deal with the cost later. The first cost was time, liquid and uneven. Randy moved him through unfinished rooms and unregistered lodgings that smelled like disinfectant and plywood, places where the sound of a siren meant wait and not welcome. He called in favors from people who only worked in cash and owed him more than money, traded a classic car chassis for a surgeon's weekend discretion, and watched as Jason woke into a body that had lost its map. There were days with the hum of portable machines and nights when even the pain seemed to give up and let exhaustion rule, and always the knowledge that the spine had been punished beyond negotiation. The verdict arrived softly, wrapped in medical phrases and percentages that tried to sound clinical and not cruel: no return to the old stride, no sprint into the familiar rooms of the old life, a future redesigned without consultation. The legs were there, but the pathways between decision and motion were a ruin. The body had kept the architecture and lost the electricity. Jason stared at the wheelchair like it belonged to another story. Then he learned how to transfer, how to bathe without falling, how to fear a staircase, how to count victories in centimeters. Meanwhile, the town performed its pageant of grief. Lauren wore black with a steadiness that made neighbors whisper about strength and made her son wonder what was missing from her eyes. John hosted condolences with a precision that looked like loyalty and felt like bookkeeping. Alex moved through speculation like a boxer, angry at shadows and mirrors, then quieter and not better. There were flowers and articles and a memorial that turned admiration into currency, and in the privacy of an unused bedroom Jason saw a clip on a phone screen and watched his life be described as finished. He felt anger bloom not at the lie of death but at the freedom it gave everyone else. With him dead, the complicated could be simplified, debts could be settled in the court of public sympathy, and secrets that involved him could be sealed with a myth. Randy kept him from making calls he wasn't ready to complete and from making promises his body couldn't keep, and promised work, physical therapy, newer equipment, a specialist who liked impossible cases, the quiet grind of recovery that nobody would film. Recovery built its own language. There were mornings he could feel heat where there shouldn't be any, phantom sensations that tricked him into hope and then retreated. There were meticulous routines, upper body conditioning, core engagement, pressure sort checks that replaced business itineraries and reduced triumph to repetitions completed before dawn. The mirror delivered new math: strength that relocated to shoulders and arms, weight that refused to stabilize, the unnegotiable presence of the chair. The mind offered bargains: give me one more inch of movement and I'll surrender anything you ask. When bargains failed, darker trades proposed themselves. Pills wore neutral labels that masked louder promises, and Randy watched dosages like a sentinel, aware that necessity could slip into comfort and comfort into habit. Jason learned the quiet discipline of refusing what would numb him into compliance. He also learned the louder discipline of accepting help from the one person whose life had already complicated itself by saving him. What the town called healing was a reallocation of territory. Deals moved into folders without his initials. People who used to see him learned not to. A yacht changed hands in a transaction calibrated to look tasteful. A foundation bore his name to raise funds that had nothing to do with his consent. Lauren smiled on stages and tried to turn survival into purpose. John leveraged condolence into leverage. Alex looked for culprits and found too many faces to punch, then stopped punching and started writing notes that read like confessions and felt like instructions. In the quiet room where Jason pushed a chair across a floor that wasn't yet home, he watched the ecosystem of his absence achieve stability and understood the arithmetic. His return would be not a miracle but a liability. The old alliances were too comfortable without him. The tragedies he had absorbed had been redistributed, and nobody in power wanted the ledger disturbed. So the plan they formed was brutal in its simplicity: heal enough to choose, learn enough to survive, gather enough proof to return without permission. Randy arranged a sequence of tests that doubled as alibis and vetted a therapist who never looked surprised by anger. They practiced contingencies. They listed the assets that mattered more than money, the true sequence of the crash, the messages that preceded it, the signatures that moved capital in the hours after his death. And Jason, once the man who outran consequences by acting faster than they could assemble, learned to wait. But waiting in a hidden life is not a neutral act. It corrodes patience and makes suspicion grow additional roots. When the first proof surfaced that something in the official story had been curated, footage of a tow truck that arrived too quickly, metadata that suggested a message had been rewritten, he felt the old hunger return and hated himself for it. The hunger wasn't for justice. It was for the feeling of standing again at the center and calling it inevitability. The day he tried his first public trial without announcing himself was the day he learned how cruel ordinary spaces could be. A curb cut too steep, a door that opened the wrong way, a server who spoke only to Randy, a window where he caught his reflection and didn't recognize the man or the chair. He had thought the fight would be with other people's choices. It turned out the earlier rounds would be with architecture and etiquette and the vocabulary in his own head. He went home and trained harder and said nothing out loud. That night the phone lit with a message he wasn't supposed to read, a fundraiser theme that turned his accident into narrative, a caption that polished tragedy into brand, and something inside him stopped asking for mercy and started making lists. What nobody in Fairmont Crest fully understood was that a rescue can be the beginning of a different kind of fall. Randy's decision up on that cliff had created a second crash, one where the wheels did not leave the ground but everything else lost traction. By choosing life, Jason had entered an economy where his survival would be negotiated like a contract and his body would become a problem to be solved rather than a person to be heard. And because the world loved closure more than correction, the people who benefited from his absence had already learned to speak of him in the past tense without flinching. The return would require not only courage but cruelty, to himself, to the illusions that propped up the people he once loved, to the story that made everyone else feel generous. When the news finally reached him, through a former colleague who still believed in debts paid forward, that certain accounts tied to him had been liquidated under emergency clauses no one could have enacted without help from a grieving inner circle, the decision was made with the calm of a man who no longer feared falling. Part 2 would not be about unveiling a miracle. It would be about walking, or wheeling, straight into the middle of a house that had already divided his memory into useful parts and lighting up every room with proof. What he did not yet know was how darkness bargains when its profits are threatened, or how loneliness feeds on the hours after applause fades. He would learn those lessons quickly, and he would learn them from the faces he used to trust. The re-entry was undercover at first, a cameo in the life he used to manage. Jason left the safe rooms Randy had curated and moved to a rental where the elevator worked half the time and the neighbors minded their own business better than any security firm. He mapped the city not by status but by accessibility, learned the schedules of ramps and the temperament of drivers who understood wheelchairs and the price of modest independence. He found a clinic where the staff treated him like a patient without pity, and a gym where the trainer demanded form instead of apologies. Randy secured a lawyer whose advice came in 2 dialects, official and plausible, and together they built a portfolio of facts that would survive the spin cycle. Each document was a brick. Each brick was a defense against the day charisma would fail him and truth would need weight. The day he showed himself to Lauren was not staged for sympathy. He chose a corridor where cameras couldn't pretend to be accidental, asked Randy to wait around the corner, and let the moment arrive like weather. Grief carries its own choreography, and recognition can short-circuit it. For a second, the world did that trick where it gives a person back and then takes the floor out from under everyone watching. There were no tears that afternoon, only adjustments. Adjustments to tone. Adjustments to assets. Adjustments to what a reunion meant in a town that speaks in contracts. The hug the world would later see belonged to another day, on a stage with better lighting. The first day was about inventory, what had survived, what could be reclaimed, what would have to be burned. The inventory offended both of them, and the offense felt like honesty. Publicly, the reveal came with applause and commentary, the kind that turns tragedy into resilience by sheer repetition. Privately, it detonated alliances carefully formed in his absence. John's phone started ringing with people who wanted a new arrangement, investors who preferred a ghost to the complexities of a man in a chair with a memory for dates and signatures. Alex's rage disguised itself as relief for half a day before it started hunting for where to put itself. The city discovered its appetite for miracle content and kept asking for more. Jason smiled for exactly the number of minutes required by the function he was attending and then left through a service exit that was not designed for the chair they promised had been accommodated. Outside, in an unlit corner that smelled like detergent and hot metal, he very nearly asked Randy to take him back to the rooms where the world's reach had been shorter. He did not ask. He tightened his grip on the wheel rims and went home to plan the counter-narrative. The counter-narrative required exhibits the audience would hate. It is easy to applaud a survivor, it is harder to watch what survival actually takes. So he showed them. He brought cameras to therapy not for inspiration but for accounting, the time, the pain, the repetitions that only produce marginal gains, the bruises that form where bodies meet equipment. He published the emails that choreographed his disappearance into opportunity, scrubbed of names but full of timestamps. He testified, in forms that made lawyers sit up straighter, that the emergency clauses enabling asset transfers were triggered while he was still being moved, long before a doctor had signed any certificate. He presented a printout of the fundraiser caption that had been edited 3 times to shape the tone toward uplift and away from accountability. The town congratulated him on his courage and then called their publicists. The machinery turned faster, and he understood that evidence is only as powerful as the courage of those who are asked to believe it. When the money began to move against him, the pressure became a geometry problem. Apartments with elevators that always worked cost more than forgiveness. The specialized chair with the features his therapist wanted carried a price tag that laughed at pride. The medications that kept nerve pain from swallowing nights whole were rationed by people who measured relief in 90-day packages. Insurance became a labyrinth that paid for half a staircase and none of the stairs. He signed papers that felt like compromises and swallowed the taste they left. Randy took extra shifts that paid in secrets. The lawyer began sentences with phrases about risk tolerance. On one late evening when the muscles in his back seized and refused to unclench, Jason envisioned the version of himself who would have fixed these problems by threatening to remove a line item from the right portfolio. Then he practiced the new response, breathing until the cramp released and asking for help without hating the person providing it. What he could not ask for, because no one could give it, was the return of the old scale, the one that measured worth by speed and volume and how loudly a room changed when he entered it. The new scale was crueler and truer. It measured whether he could get through a shower without incident. How he conserved energy so he could attend the meeting that couldn't be moved, how he hid frustration from the staff who were trying to learn his preferences because teaching drains the teacher first. It counted micro-humiliations and forced him to calculate whether dignity was worth the delay. The negativity in this phase was not melodrama, it was math. For each unit of progress he could prove, there were 3 units of structural resistance. And because the narrative machine in Fairmont Crest preferred its victims pure and its victors photogenic, the man who refused both categories was granted fewer pages. The worst decisions announced themselves as kindness. A settlement offer arrived that would have stabilized him for a year and erased the trail of irregularities that pointed at people with expensive reputations. Another offer promised influence without titles and visibility without power, the exact architecture of the prison he had just escaped. A non-profit requested his face for a campaign he would not be allowed to influence. A journalist he trusted once asked to borrow his pain for a story that could not afford his complexity. He said no until his body reminded him that refusals cost more calories than acceptance, and then he chose his yes strategically and hated the taste less than he expected. The victories felt like losses with better lighting. The losses announced themselves as progress and traveled with press kits. When the crash report was quietly amended, an administrative correction that realigned timelines in ways that absolved the most polished players. He understood that repentance in his city wears bespoke and never arrives without a tax deduction. He went to the only place that still looked like truth, the gym where he had learned to transfer the hard way. He trained until the therapist asked him to stop and then trained a little more. Randy watched from the door and did not interrupt. There are kinds of despair that need movement to spend themselves, and there are kinds of despair that want stillness to multiply. He tried to pick the first and frequently fell into the second. Nights got longer. The chair picked up new scratches. The mirror stopped being a verdict and started being a witness. The final turn into darkness did not arrive with betrayal or public humiliation. It arrived with an absence, a morning when his hands, usually faithful even when the legs were not, trembled enough to drop a cup. The sound of it breaking on the kitchen tile was louder than applause, louder than headlines, louder than the night the guardrail surrendered. He cleaned it up with careful strokes and then sat in the quiet he had been hunting since the memorial. The future he could see from that chair was not the future this town would ever celebrate. It was smaller and harsher and less photogenic. It contained fewer stages and more invoices, fewer strategies and more maintenance, fewer confrontations and more choices that no one would notice except him. It looked like survival and felt like surrender, and it terrified him because it required a different kind of courage, the daily kind that never earns a standing ovation. So he did the ugliest thing a former hero can do in public: he asked for help he could afford. He pared down the case to what mattered legally instead of morally. He accepted mobility hacks that offended his pride and kept his skin intact. He let the lawyer pursue the boring filings that produce progress invisible to cameras. He told Randy the truth about the pills on the worst night and built new routines to keep that truth from growing teeth. He visited Lauren when the calendar required it and kept the conversations on rails that would not derail either of them. He stopped promising Alex a version of justice that television taught him to expect and offered the cold version that courts sometimes deliver. It was not redemption. It was not catharsis. It was the geography of a man who would not be annihilated, even if the price of remaining himself was the silence of a smaller life. For the video you're making, that is the brutal, negative arc, a survival that unspools into disillusionment, a return that exposes the town's preference for spectacle over substance, a man who loses not only the use of his legs but the grammar that once made his days feel inevitable. The cliffhanger is not whether he will walk again. It is whether he can stand himself in a world that wants him to play a role he has outgrown and cannot perform. If there is a sequel to write later, it won't be about a miracle cure or a courtroom victory with soaring music. It will be about the dull heroism of maintenance, the unglamorous accounting of limits, and the kind of integrity that refuses to let despair finish the work the ravine began. To end, Fairmont Crest sinks into a quiet night as window lights click off one by one, leaving only the steady breathing of a city long practiced at telling other people's stories on its own terms.